Lyle Bicknell, a principal urban designer at the Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development.
Rico Quirindongo, Director of the Office of Planning and Community Development.
Corey Mathias, I'm a Senior Associate at the Miller Hole Partnership, and along with Claire, led the entry from the Miller Hole side, so I'll pass it to Claire now.
Hi, I'm Claire Runhack, Architect and Associate with the Miller Hole Partnership.
My name is Robert Humble. I'm a principal of hybrid architecture and happy to be involved.
I'm Case Creel. I'm a studio director and design manager at Gensler.
Welcome, everybody. As I mentioned before, this is a great panel. It's comprised of the three winners of our ideas contest on solutions of how we transform existing downtown office to residential. We had 14 entries. All of them were good, but the three finalists just gave us terrific work. And it's nice to have this brain trust together so that we can talk about our experience and our conclusions for the Seattle Design Festival. So with that, what I'm thinking we can do as part of this panel is I'll ask some just open questions, which everyone can jump in on. And then I'll ask some targeted questions specific to the three teams, kind of building on their specific recommendations and solutions. And then at the end of the program, we can talk about anything that people would like to build on or express as part of this whole process. With that, let's start. You know, the theme of this year's festival is curiosity. And I'm interested, really, from all the teams, as you investigated the Office to Residential Design solutions, were there any surprises? Something that challenged your initial assumptions?
I think personally I was not surprised, but I was happy to see the breadth of different presentations and different approaches to buildings, and probably also maybe kind of what we learned, I feel, is that a lot of the projects were working with structures that were kind of pre-war, you could say. And it seems like in a lot of those cases, those were better candidates for this office to housing, which I think kind of seeing a number of different approaches to that, it kind of became clear specifically maybe why. So it was nice to kind of look at different teams approaching this generally the same problem, but with different solutions given to the different buildings.
I think that's a common theme. One of the common themes that we heard looking at these 14 entries was that older buildings with more narrow footprints, not the typical larger footprints of our contemporary office tower stock, are more adaptable for a residential use because we can get light into the depth of that building envelope.
I'd jump in here with one kind of surprise from the Miller Hole team. I think, we had a really interesting opportunity to look at the building that we actually sit in every day as our case study. And at least personally, I've begun to see this building in kind of a new way and picture the evolution of this project, long after we're sort of gone, right? That this building can have many generations of sort of useful urban fabric in it, and it can continue to contribute and evolve even as economies and situations within the city change. So that's been a really cool aspect to sort of realize through this process.
Corey, that leads us quite well to the specific question that I was going to ask of you and Claire. Your solution proposed combining office and residential in one structure. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that kind of solution?
I can speak a little bit to that, Corey, and feel free to chime in here if I miss anything. But I think one thing that Corey mentioned is our project is the building in which we're sited, and our firm is located in Pioneer Square, which has a really vibrant mix of uses, businesses, residences, retail, and different scales of uses. One really interesting aspect of incorporating offices, retail, and residential into one project is we were seeing this project or proposal as a microcosm of Pioneer Square and what makes it so vibrant and active. So thinking about how we could bring in different uses into a singular building and create that microcosm of a community inside our existing walls was really compelling to us.
Yeah, and it kind of speaks to the notion that buildings don't have to be defined by a single use. They don't have to remain static over time. They can sort of ebb and flow and hopefully be adaptable enough to remain relevant. So that was sort of the fundamental premise of our proposal.
Are there some specific challenges when you do that kind of multi-function building that makes it a bit more difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we wrestled with the core configuration and how to, provide some privacy and separation between uses, but also try and find, common, benefit to the cores for both. So I think we went through a few iterations on cores. Some tried to maintain what was here. Ultimately, we decided that in order to sort of appropriately serve both uses, we needed to introduce new cores.
I really love that notion of a building ebbing and flowing, because that's so much as to how a neighborhood works. When you're looking at something at a larger scale, but really our codes are not set up for ebbing and flowing. They're set up for a single moment in time when you make a decision as to what use to call that building. So if there are ways in which we can relax, the code's ability to fix in time, what a building should be, I think that will help it become something a little bit more alive and less static.
I think maybe to add to that, I think what was really interesting about the building that we work with, the Mutual Life building in Pioneer Square, is after really doing some research on the building, it has already changed many times over its life. It was originally built as a single-story building in a depressed economy. They came back, that was in 1890. They came back 5 or 6 years later and added 5 stories to the building. And it was primarily offices for the first 60 years of its life until about 1960, when they converted it from offices to studio apartments. And then in 1980, 20 years later, they came back and did some additions to the core and some seismic upgrades and converted it from housing back to office. And now here we are 40 years later, looking about going from office back to housing. So I just think that's a great kind of case study. We kind of think about, buildings history and kind of are fixed in time and the way we are viewing it today. But I think if you really look back through the life of these buildings, they've already lived many, many lives in the future. And I think any intervention that we do should encourage, the progression of these many lives moving forward from past to present to future. So I think that it was really kind of nice of kind of understanding the building's past, where it is in the present, and then setting up in a way that I'm under no presumption that any changes to this building is going to be static and it's going to be around 20, 30, 40 years ago or from now. It's in all probability, it's not just a likelihood, it's very probable it's going to change in some way again in the future that maybe we cannot anticipate. And even thinking about, certainly over the last 3 years, how we occupy and use our housing, how we occupy and use our offices, with Zoom calls, what we're doing here today, and people working from home and working remotely. I think there's a real blurring of the boundaries between a place to work and a place to live. And that's a very contemporary phenomena that I think is very, very important to kind of address, at least in this point in time, how to kind of work on these transformations of these building infrastructure we have.
You know, we talked earlier about how pre-war buildings lend themselves a bit easier to that kind of flexibility and change. Post-war, harder, and in fact, it was telling. Most of the entries were adaptive reuse for pre-1940s building. An important exception was one of the winners, and that was Gensler, which chose to examine a 1960s era building, which has its own challenges. Specifically, as architects say, the fenestration is non-operable, or everyone else says you can't open the windows. That's an issue. It's kind of a different one, but obviously in a lot of buildings of that era and later, changing out the fenestration can be just prohibitively expensive. I'd like to hear your thoughts, Case, on kind of that your thinking there. How do we really make these post-war buildings livable?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I'll admit that we had to obscure our building a little bit at the request of the owner. And the building that we were actually looking at has punched openings, operable windows that were fixed in time at one point in time when someone came in and screwed them shut. But this building would have been very easily converted in that respect from an envelope perspective. Going forward, if we were to take a look at a newer building, that's certainly a challenge. It's not unreasonable for people who live downtown to want to have natural ventilation, and so to do that really does require a much greater expense. And so when we are looking at this, looking at the call for ideas, certainly finding ways to offset the costs, that we know are associated with these conversions, was really important to us. Are there things that could be done to mitigate the costs, in particular, that are going to be imposed by the existing building code? Certainly, a lot of them are necessary to keep people safe. We're not arguing that seismic considerations should be ignored. They certainly shouldn't. But are there ways in which you can, we can find common ground with the need to bring these buildings, up to date and the need to have them occupied? That was a big push on our part.
Big challenges, absolutely. Robert, the judges for this process were, the panel of our judges was particularly impressed by the innovative thinking that your team did with unit and unit configurations, proposing such things as co-living, I think is what you called it, where you would have a number of the functions of a residential unit shared in common, which was a great way to get at affordability, given that not every unit would have to have all the amenities, and that a lot of the function could happen elsewhere in a shared way. The co-living idea is a terrific one, and I'd love to see it replicated. One question I have for you is, in your model, at least typically co-living is a group of people who've agreed to live together. Could you see this model applying to folks who are just looking for an inexpensive place to live?
Sure. I mean, I could give a little of my personal history. I moved here, after college 30 years ago, and with no job. I never moved up to Seattle sight unseen, and I moved into a share house in Capitol Hill that was an old 4-story structure that had been broken into kind of 2 apartments with 2 kitchens and I think a total of 12 bedrooms. And I had 11 roommates, and I think a total of 3 or 4 bathrooms and a couple of kitchens that we shared. And at that time in my life, it was great. I met a lot of people. Not everybody was my age, but a lot of them were, and a lot of them were very transitory. Some of them, I ended up staying for almost 3 years there because I enjoyed it. And I think, our office is involved in any number of housing types, and they're kind of getting smaller and smaller, from a C2 apartment that has its own little kitchen, its own little bath, doesn't really have a whole lot of room to live in, but it's self-contained, to a congregate residence, which supposedly, as the name implied, is about the congregate part of it, but I think they also live very kind of self-contained. And the congregate spaces, it can be difficult for people to actually use them. So I think, really one primary strategy that we had, number one, was to reduce the amount of penetrations through the floor plate or through the existing building. So by kind of ganging our plumbing, we reduced the number of bathrooms in the project. We gang a little maybe kitchenette behind a plumbing wall for a bathroom, and they could share that stack. But also it's kind of a middle ground. I mean, really what we wanted to see was, there was a time when the most affordable housing in Seattle was SROs, or single room occupancies, which were primarily in Pioneer Square. And those have gone out of favor and are illegal, I would feel, in most cases right now, to replicate that model, and probably rightly so. They're not the most livable. But we kind of took that as inspiration. How can we kind of create an SRO housing for this new generation that's incorporating new ideas of community and new ideas of living together? And I think in a lot of, we actually are doing co-housing projects in the city of Seattle and in Germany right now. And I think it's a real emerging thing. And I think, and frankly, the call for ideas and entries was very clear. They wanted to look at different ways of looking at housing. So if we're going to ever enter any kind of competition, why are we entering? Are we entering to get some ideas out there? Are we entering to create some cool graphics? No, we're entering to win. So if we're going to win, we're going to follow the rules. So we did a couple of case studies of creating, 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom and urban 1 bedroom apartments in here. But we've got thousands of those unit types being created throughout this city. I don't think we need any more of those unit types. I think we need to be exploring truly affordable housing in this city, because there's multiple crises that the city's confronted with. Obviously, it's a housing and affordability go hand in hand. The Pioneer Square in particular has seen better decades, and the fact that there's a lot of this building that we chose, we walked through it. I mean, it is primarily empty. There was probably a time in the 80s when they did that remodel. It was kind of built for lawyers, but lawyers are not in there now. So that, once again, is kind of is a resource, not only from the building, but for the neighborhood, that we feel bringing the density and some new residents in it at an affordable price is kind of killing two birds with one stone.
Robert, I had a question because I thought that your proposal was particularly intriguing. Your congregate residences and the small efficiency dwelling units hover around 200 square feet and around 1,000 to 1,200 a month. Do you think that those would be competitive in the market given their size?
Do you mean the congregate or the small efficiency dwellings?
Either or both.
I think the co-living model, because they basically are, I think because they're sharing a bathroom, that you actually have more livable space. And there are a client of ours that has recently developed a co-living model where basically people that don't know each other, maybe 2 or 3 people, share the same bath. And we kind of laid out the units in a way that you'd have clusters of 2 to 3 bedrooms. It kind of enter, for lack of a better term, a cluster, a little apartment through a door, but the bathroom was accessed not internally through an individual's dwelling, but through a hallway. And what that allows is basically for the bathrooms to be cleaned by a third party. So this goes a long way. This is the way these things typically operate, is that there's a service that comes in and cleans the bathroom and cleans the co-living space. So we wanted to kind of allow for that. I think that's kind of where a lot of the friction, frankly, comes from co-living. Certainly 30 years ago, when I was living, with 11 roommates, most of the friction was about someone leaving their dirty dishes in the sink or the dirty towel on the bathroom floor. So I think we're trying to find an opportunity to kind of find a middle ground there. And I do think these units could be, once again, competitively priced with congregate residents and small efficiency dwelling units, frankly. I mean, we were pushing to try to get the price down as low as possible. And I think a lot of that has to do with really basically the amount of upgrades to the building. The nice thing about our building, it already had operable windows. It actually had, in the 80s, they added a second stair, so it actually met exiting just the way it is. It had some structural upgrades also in the 80s. Whether those would meet today's standards or not would be a good question for a structural engineer. But I think that the basic infrastructure was really there. So if we talk about improvements to the building, it's energy efficiency, it's seismic upgrades. These are obviously very, very important things. But kind of, if we have to make some compromises, where can compromises be made to find middle ground?
I just wanted to add on to the co-housing discussion. And one of the things that we found is that in post-war buildings, the depth of the floor plate oftentimes is one of those drawbacks to typical current unit planning, and the co-living model is one way to address that. When we've taken a look at newer buildings, whether they're Class A, B, or C, post-war, the floor plates tend to be much deeper, and I think the reasons for that have long been bandied about. But the co-housing, co-living model does solve that, in a lot of different ways. You can shorten up the unit depth for those areas that are private, that really do want to have access to windows, and some of the portions that can be held in common can occupy that zone closer to the core, and maybe within the core where you might have existing bathrooms to take advantage of plumbing. I know Robert's solution looked at a lot of that, but I think it can be adapted to newer buildings as well. The trick would be to find a building that has a price point, a more recent Class B building or Class C building that could accommodate that.
This raises the big question that unless you're looking at some smart co-housing proposal like Robert suggested, the kind of units that we naturally produce through these conversions tend to be very high-end, just by the nature of the costs. And we've learned from other jurisdictions all over the country that the way to get to affordability is basically through government subsidy, somehow incentivizing affordability. I'd love to hear just everyone's thoughts on what's the best way to incentivize. Is that straight dollars? Is it, what way can government, if we are choosing to subsidize, what can be the most effective way to get there?
Part of our decision to mix both uses and sort of income level of residential units was to help subsidize within the project itself. So by keeping two levels of commercial office space in our pro forma, those were generating higher revenue and actually helping to offset the 3 floors of workforce housing. Then we took all of the area that was displaced by the introduction of the courtyard into that mass and introduced it as sort of high-end luxury units around the top of the building. So through the mixture of those program elements, we were starting to sort of subsidize within the project. That doesn't get to the policy question of what government can do, but that was sort of how we approached it from an architectural perspective.
Maybe tackling on to Corey's response in terms of what government could do or what the city could do. We looked a lot to other cities and municipalities who are doing similar things or looking at office to residential conversions also. I think California is doing an opportunity zone in downtown cores to attract investor money that would look at this type of conversion. That was something we proposed that we could look at as the city of Seattle. I think also we looked at Calgary and their downtown development incentive program where you could provide a grant specifically for office to resi conversions. Also, any sort of speed to market, streamlining of the entitlement process, something that would really save down on the entitlement costs and the scheduling costs, really time being money, are things that could attract developers to take on these type of projects. So we came at this from twofold, much framed out by Rico and the city's challenge is to really look at it as a policy perspective, but also to look at architecturally what we could do to help address this.
Well, I think, in addition to the solutions that Claire noted, one of the things that we were looking at was how to get more certainty up front in a process, in the project process. When you're dealing with a commercial TI, you know exactly what your scope is going to be right away. You've got a building code that you can work against, and there are no surprises. And certainly with the existing building code, that's something that terrifies almost every developer who would undertake one of these, because you don't know until you've invested an awful lot of money what the scope of your project is. So trying to get more certainty on these projects earlier on, I think would be really, really helpful. And again, it's just not to remove the safety concerns behind the existing building code, but when you're dealing with a commercial TI, you're dealing oftentimes with far more people who are going to spend a lot longer time in these buildings. I think to me that there should be some recognition that the building does not change all of a sudden, even though you change the use of it. Though I recognize that it's an opportunity for taking advantage of an opportunity to upgrade the building. But if you could treat them more like TIs, both in speed and in consistency of the application of the code, I think you would tend to get more of these happening. That in and of itself won't change the cost. The costs are still going to be a challenge, but I think you sort of have to look in multiple ways for ways to get at this.
Excellent. I've got one final question for the collective panel. Proximity to work used to be the big draw for living downtown, and that's not quite the case anymore. Downtown has to provide other things if we're going to encourage to move into these great buildings that you all have proposed. I'd love to get the whole panel's thoughts on what are some of the things the city should be doing, others should be doing to promote the desirability of wanting to live downtown as we add more residential units in our core.
I think a lot of it has already happened. I think we've kind of laid the infrastructure over the last 10 to 20 years with building out mass transit, which reduces the need for individual car ownership, which in a lot of these older buildings, at least in ours, didn't have parking. Obviously, there's just technological changes. If you needed to get a ride share or something to go out to Mount Rainier one day, you can rent a car by the day. Obviously, in case of Pioneer Square, in a big swath of downtown, with the removal of the viaduct, it's a much more pleasant place to be. I guess I think downtown living is always going to be an attractive place for a certain segment of the population, but maybe not everybody. I think really what is missing and we can work on moving forward is how can we get more families downtown. I think a lot of the new housing we create and a lot of the people that are living in more of the urban areas are generally younger people, and at some point those people are going to choose to have a family, and downtown doesn't really have a much housing stock that encourages that. But I think another really important thing to talk about is, like, what is the definition of family. I think we talk about family in our mind is not this nuclear family with mom and dad and 2 kids. There's a lot of different families now that could be a couple of friends that choose to cohabitate are a family. You could have an elderly person and a caretaker or a family. You have, single parents. That's a family. So I think a lot of times we just think about this family in a very kind of outdated mode, and how can we kind of encourage uh, uh, housing for families of all types in our downtown areas moving forward.
The jury, Claire, I was just going to say the jury was really impressed with your work and Miller Hull's proposal in that it actually demonstrated a strategy for how you could grow a unit as the units change or as the needs change. And that was really impressive because it is hard, as everyone knows, to get affordable 3 unit or 3 bedroom units. And the idea that you could have something that would grow to meet the needs was a compelling part of Miller Hull's project.
Yeah, just thinking about what Robert said in reflection to the JCFO plan and the revitalization of the waterfront, I think going back to the original question is how can we think about attracting people back to downtown? Yes, for sure, programming, enlivening the downtown, bringing a sense of vibrancy back, I think is done through activity and programming. And you're seeing a lot of that now on the waterfront or even some in the Denny Triangle, whether it's through DSA or through private enterprises like Amazon is doing in the Denny Triangle. I think a lot of that really does help bring back programming for a multitude of different people and communities. So imagining just 10 years ago that seeing the JCFO plans for the waterfront and not being able to imagine that being a reality. And then with our building, the Polson building being located right in Pioneer Square next to Coleman Dock, being part of that process, seeing the viaduct come down, the reorganization of the streets, the planting and the reconnection to the waterfront, I think that has really reinvigorated this perimeter of Seattle. And I'm hoping that we can think about ways to do that in the downtown core as well. I mean, to address your second question about family programming and Robert's point that families can look a lot of different ways these days. Um, Part of our proposal with the cellular structure, the nature of inserting a cellular grid into the existing heavy timber structure of the 1906 warehouse, is the idea that we're forming these units that are all very similar and modular, but that throughout time they could connect, be locked together to address growing needs, multiple bedrooms, intergenerational living, but adding some sort of flexibilities for units to grow and take on adjacent units and become larger, or to flex back down to accommodate the different needs of that particular population. Um, Corey, I don't know if you want to add anything on to that.
No, that was a great description. I think it again just kind of reinforces our desire to look at like a long term evolution of this building, and the idea that units can sort of aggregate and connect in really interesting spatial configurations too is very exciting as a sort of architectural concept. So
Yeah, we studied a bit about how units could kind of multiply or join with their adjacent units on the same floor, but also how they could start punching up or punching down through levels so you could expand vertically as well as horizontally. And I think our particular building, because of its heavy timber structure on a specific grid, really accommodated itself to that type of growth.
And then long term, I know we need to have a higher population to support it, but of course, there's always the long term conversation about a downtown school, or at least a school that's a little bit closer to the downtown. But rather than considering this as a new building, is this another opportunity for reuse? I think what we know is that learning environments look an awful lot more like offices these days. So is that another opportunity for us to engage in adaptive reuse, to engage in opportunities to revitalize the downtown? That may be some time off, but may not be that far off.
We limited this discussion to conversion to residential, but conversion to biotech, conversion to university use, conversion even to elementary school. Those are great options too, because they help the health of the downtown as well. I'm going to end it here at this point. I'd love to, if anyone had something they wanted to say and they didn't say it, or have any other thoughts, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to hear them now.
I think we'd just like to thank the city for opening this competition up. Miller Hull's firm is really rooted in curiosity and considering the bigger questions that affect our community, and we love to work in this type of speculative conceptual realm. So having the opportunity to do something like that so close to our hearts and so close to our city was a really great opportunity. So thank you, Rico and Lyle.
Of course, we've been in a conversation with multiple cities across the nation about the revitalization of our downtowns, and one of those components was this office to residential discussion, and internally in our office, we really got inspired by the idea of, well, let's stop arm waving about this subject, and let's have a real brass tacks discussion about what might be possible. So I would say that we are really indebted to everybody who participated in the competition, and very thankful to your three firms, Hybrid, Gensler, and Miller Hull, for your really beautiful, innovative ideas and prospective solutions. I'm super excited for the city to support those, both the ideas and the actual projects that have been proposed, knowing that probably only a handful of them will happen. But it's I think it's really inspirational as we look at new ways of living, new ways of occupying space, how to make our downtown streets more vibrant. I think that you have presented a bunch of great ideas here, and very timely. And I would say to the audience watching, we're the cities in the Office of Planning and Community Development is leading the effort for our comprehensive plan major update. So our One Seattle plan. Please do get involved. Know that our contemplation regarding missing middle housing and providing housing for people at all levels, that's something that we're spending a lot of time looking at our how our city policies can support the city as we continue to grow and evolve. So thank you all for your participation.
I guess if I have a closing thought, it's I think that it's kind of a time for big ideas. We're involved in a lot of market rate housing in the city and have been in the last 10 years or so, and those projects have more or less stopped over the last year and a half because of the cost of construction, cost of lending, and what the market rate housing developers will say is they're not going to start again till interest rates come down and rents go up. So that to me is just not an encouraging sign that we've kind of put a pause in a big way of the creation of housing over the last couple of years. And the only thing that's going to get it going again, at least that you'd have any control over, is rents. So I think we have a very over the last 30 years I've lived here, the city's demographic has changed substantially. And over the last 3 years, our big tech employers have been laying people off and not hiring. And I could just see a not too distant future when this storm blows over in a year or two, whenever it is, that these companies are going to be hiring again, rents are going to be going up again, cost of construction is likely not going to be going down, and we're going to be in a bigger crisis than we are now. I think it's always been the kind of the economic slow times when people can kind of sit back and have the time and resources to really think deeply about this in retrospect of what led us to this point. So how can we lay the groundwork for the next 10-year expansion if that's what it is, and to do it now. It's a cycle, and we're at the bottom of a cycle, and we're going to come back out of it, and it's going to cycle up again. So the decisions we're making today are going to greatly impact the capacity for new housing in the city during the next cycle.
That's a great call to arms to end on. I think that was a great discussion. Really appreciate everyone's insight, conversation. This has been a real pleasure, and I look forward to seeing the final run.